Welcome all EMF warriors to another podcast. I'm here today with a really special guest. His name is Dr. Rob Brown, and he has just put out a new book called Toxic Home, Conscious Home. And in this book, he goes into a lot of different issues and problems that we can encounter in the household. And of course, EMF is one of those things. So would really love to get your insights on all this. And I really am really honored to have another doctor on the show today because we can really learn some valuable information. Thanks for being here, Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you, Mr. Spock. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I go by a few different aliases. Mr. Spock's my EMF one. I also go by Scompy, but yeah, I do this just to put the logic, the science behind this issue so people understand it's a real thing and we're going to logically attack it to get the public aware of this issue. So speaking of your background, you used to be a doctor, right? And you worked with a lot of MRIs, X-ray machines, this kind of stuff. Is that true?
Yes, I'm a radiologist. I'm still a radiologist. I still work. Although now I'm working through teleradiology. I'm working over the internet. I read for a group out in Phoenix, Arizona, even though I live in the Pittsburgh area.
Great. Yeah, so what's interesting is that just 2 podcasts ago, we had one of our EMF warriors, a member on, and she had been through an MRI and over in England, and her MRI actually, she didn't have like any injections, like pre-injections or anything injected into her for the MRI, but she just had a straight MRI and she just responded so poorly to it. I mean, she got really deathly ill for several months afterward. It's interesting how some people, can have the MRI, really no effect at all. Other people will go into them and just be, have a lot of bad reactions to them. I'm really curious if over the years of your experience as a radiologist, if you've encountered this kind of issue, or is it kind of more of a rare thing, or is there actually more of an explanation you might be able to get into for, people that have claimed at least that they've suffered some damage from MRIs or other technologies?
So, MRIs, I would consider to be one of the safer imaging tools in the radiology department. Most of the imaging technologies that we use have, they use ionizing radiation. So whether you're having a CAT scan or a mammogram, or you're having a fluoroscopic procedure like an upper GI series, you're being bombarded by, X-rays, ionizing radiation. And so we assume that that is more dangerous than being exposed to electromagnetic frequencies and radio frequency pulses. With that being said, even with the sources of X-ray and a fluoroscopic procedure, which does, it gives the patient quite a dose when you're standing in front of a fluoroscope for 5 minutes being examined for the passage of contrast material through your gut. I've never seen somebody have an acute reaction to X-rays or a CAT scan or an MRI. Well, actually, let me come back to that in a minute. But there are acute reactions and there are chronic reactions. So just for people that may not know, an acute reaction is one that we see happens right after the exposure, and a chronic reaction may happen several weeks, months, or even years after the exposure. Acute reactions, we can assess, well, was the patient burned? Did they become nauseated? Was there some effect that immediately occurred? That you can kind of link A to B. If there's a chronic reaction, it's very hard sometimes to tell. Now, what we have found is, when patients are injected with contrast material for a CAT scan or an IVP to look at the kidneys, or even the gadolinium contrast that we use in an MRI machine, they can have an acute reaction, and that is perhaps the most dangerous. Sometimes people even have anaphylactic reaction from contrast material, and they need to be brought to the ER, and all kinds of terrible things can happen. So that's what I would consider the most dangerous acute reaction. I did listen to the podcast with the woman from England, and I thought, her story was very interesting. I have seen patients complain of burning sensations at sites of tattoos.
Hmm.
Sometimes the metal that is injected in with the tattoo art can heat up and cause a burning sensation. I have had patients rarely say they don't feel quite right in the MRI scanner, and they're given a ball to squeeze, and if they want to be pulled out, they squeeze the ball, and we take them out of the unit, and that's the end of it. Some people are claustrophobic, of course, and they can't tolerate an MRI exam. Um, I've had several scans myself. I'll tell you that I feel fuzzy in the head when after an MRI. Sometimes it can last a few hours. You just feel a little bit confused and not quite thinking clearly. And I do believe it's related to the radio frequency pulses. Um, and we are we're electric beings, right? We have our own EMF field around us. All living systems do, right? And when you're exposed to exogenous EMF or radio frequency pulses, you can absorb that energy potentially, and it can augment your field or it can diminish it, right? You can either be synchronistic or antagonistic. So perhaps, this woman that you interviewed, maybe her innate biological frequency was a certain harmonic to the radio frequency pulses that they were using during the scan, and she absorbed the energy more than she otherwise should have. Very, very unusual. I mean, I've seen thousands and thousands of patients go through an MRI scanner. I've never had that occur, but I believe her story. I'm just trying to think of a way that could be possible.
Yeah, well, my background in biology and like studying all the more recent findings in quantum biology and such, certain things hit me. For instance, just like your exclusion zone water, which is from Gerald Pollack's work up at the University of Washington. Like, I think there's going to be a different, like redox status with water inside of cells and how well a person is actually hydrated in their cells, which probably can play a conditional role in all this. Like metal toxicity, other, oxidative stressors that could be happening based on the environment you're living in. Like, if you just happen to live around, for instance, a lot of microwave radio frequency all the time, it could pretty much lower. I would suspect it could lower your immuno, uh, you know, pretty much your health for your immunology, could have other effects on other systems in your body, including like even your myelin status, right? Um, I'm sure diet plays into it, all different things. I mean, it's such a myriad of potential synergies with EMFs that I think viewing each individual person and how they've lived, where they've lived, what they've consumed can really play a role in when you go into like have some procedure done. If Yeah, if you want to comment to that.
Well, I think your state of hydration really is important for so many reasons. It's very important to be well hydrated most of the time. All kinds of things can happen just because things can dry up. You can get kidney stones, you can get gallstones, you can get calcium deposition in your tendons and your ligaments, which can become inflamed and cause tendonitis. I mean, all kinds of things can happen when you don't have adequate hydration. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if EMF the toxic effects of EMF were related to that too.
Yeah, it's really an interesting issue, really, as we're pushing forward and we're just over, especially the last 20 years with more microwave being in the air around us, being hit with this. It's going to take a longer time really to get to the scientific observations to show what really synergies are happening. The one doctor that I like to quote a lot and is Dr. Martin Pall in his work, where he's showing like more potential direct exposures to create like peroxynitrite as a free radical with EMF exposures. But it gets me really thinking about just all the growing EMF soup out there, and the technologies, not just the normal 5G on the horizon, everything like that, but what's going on in hospitals. Like there's many nurses and doctors who have been talking about, all of the systems, all the new technologies that are being brought into the hospital setting. And it makes me wonder, like, what kind of exposures patients are going to have, especially after recovery, after a surgery, to some of the EMFs just in that environment. I don't know if you can go into any of that or what you're seeing on the horizon, but is it true that we're just as time goes on, we're just most likely going to be exposed to more technologies even in the hospital?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, we are. The department in the hospital where you're encountering the greatest concentration of machinery per patient is in the ICU, the intensive care unit.
Mhm.
And all these monitoring devices, they are all wireless now, and they're communicating with the nurses stationed down the hallway, sending information about the patient's status. From what I understand, though, the testing, the EMF currents are not as strong as that of a cell phone. So the greatest concentration of EMF that patients are experiencing is still from cell phone use in the room, in the patient's room. So there's this background current. Now, is that going to have an effect on the health status? It's possible. The monitoring equipment is typically 4 or 5 feet away from a patient, and because of the inverse square law, the amount that they're actually being affected is probably not so great. What concerns me the most in these settings, though, is that there's no darkness, and the patient's constantly being woken
That's right.
for testing. And we're discovering that light is so important to maintaining circadian rhythms and melatonin production. And when a patient is in the hospital and they're never getting darkness,
Hmm.
their melatonin levels drop, their immune systems drop. It's bad for overall health. And so I'm hoping that and EMF, of course, I don't know if you want to cover this later, but EMF is also associated with melatonin suppression.
That's right.
So all of these things are causing the patient to perhaps not heal as quickly. They do better at home.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Back about a year ago, I actually was able to measure a bed, and this was a bed at somebody's home, but it was very much like a hospital bed. And it just so happened there was a very strong electric field and magnetic field associated with the bed. And it got me thinking, whoa, like in hospitals, I wonder how well shielded the beds are as another potential source of EMF. But then, like
Hmm.
what you just said, it's like absolutely um, yeah, just the potential of the lighting alone with the new LEDs being brought in, the blue light exposure, actually up to the green light wavelengths, like up to 550 nanometers, have been shown to have potential melatonin suppression effects, at least in some of the science. So
Hmm.
it gets me quite concerned that absolutely, in thinking of, for instance, my mother, I'll just get into a little personal story here. My mother, she died back in 2013, but she also had a sepsis attack 6 weeks before she passed away.
Hmm.
And she was brought into the ICU, and she was actually kind of semi-coherent, in a state where she needed some real help because of the sepsis that we didn't know she was having at the time. But the moment she was brought into the ICU, like 5 minutes later, she started going into seizures, having problems. She has her whole life always complained about going into supermarkets under really bright lights, and almost had like, like I want to get out of this brightness. But she happened to come into the ICU late at night, like, in like the 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock range, just when your
Hmm.
melatonin is right building up. I know I see this all in retrospect, and I look at
Yeah.
different things in my life and go, wow, that kind of matches what all the researchers and doctors, and now like the Nobel Prize, people in that just happened in 2017. It's like the circadian rhythm is so important for your health. I mean,
Right.
so wonderfully important because melatonin as a free radical scavenger will go in and help fight those free radicals. And if you don't have that down and you really disrupt it, absolutely, I could see how now seeing my mom in the sepsis unit for over 2 weeks, recovering, that recovery time was really long. And sometimes I was there till 3 or 4 in the morning, and absolutely, it's just fully fluorescent lighting situation going on through for all the patients. They can't really get their sleep well.
Right. Yeah, if there was a way for these hospitals to do the job they have to do and, seal off however they can by either little cabinets or some type of veil to cover up the lighting sources so that the patients can get rest. Make the monitors, so instead of making this constant beeping sound, have them muted so that
Right.
there's no sound.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think the whole melatonin phenomenon is very interesting. And the more I was thinking about it, it really is exactly inversely related to vitamin D and sunlight. In the
Absolutely.
sun, in the summer, we have, especially in the northern latitudes, we have greater, longer days, greater amounts of sunlight. We produce more vitamin D, and we have diminished levels of melatonin, right? Because the nights are shorter.
Hmm.
But then in the winter time, we have diminished levels of vitamin D, but we should have greater amounts of melatonin. And both vitamin D and melatonin bolster the immune system. So to me, it's like a yin yang. It's you have I like the image of a yin yang for that because
Hmm.
the white would be summer and the black circle inside might be vitamin D, and the reverse for the for winter. But yeah, we're learning all these things. There is some advancement in the field of medicine and science, and although a lot of people knew this stuff intuitively, the
Hmm.
scientists are trying to figure it out now.
Yeah,
You know,
I absolutely love that analogy, and it's just a wonderful observation that you just made there. I think of it the same way, like the best sources of a cancer lowering agent on the planet to me is the sun and really good sleep cycles and stimulating the melatonin production for. I think of it this way: getting out into the morning sun, getting sun through the eyes to prep the body for stimulating the melatonin stronger in the evening. So earlier that same day, um, getting that light frequency hitting in through the eyes to get the body into a stronger swing, a stronger rhythm. So then when night comes, the body knows now is my time for melatonin through the pineal gland, right?
exactly. I mean, if you don't have full spectrum light during the day, then your pineal gland won't recognize when it's nighttime, and so the melatonin doesn't get produced like it should. And I don't believe that these melatonin supplements are really where it's at. I think that your body should produce it when it's supposed to be produced, not when you remember to take a pill. I
Yeah.
think that the effects are different.
Yeah, I have the same viewpoint. In looking at different types of diseases and research over the years, the stomach biome produces a lot of melatonin on its own, but it's not like in the places of the body necessarily where your body needs the melatonin everywhere, and of course every cell in your body uses the melatonin. So yeah, just getting in at one spot and then just imagining, hey, is this melatonin, is it going to get through my stomach acid? Is it going to get pulled up into my bloodstream? Is all this going to work well compared to getting your sleep cycle down where you know it works well?
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. So let's move on to a really interesting subject, a subject we talk about all the time at EMF Warriors, the synergies between EMFs and other hazards like molds, bacteria, viruses, things that are found around our environments. Like where I live here in Oregon, there isn't too much, like for instance, black mold, but some houses do have it, especially if they have some moisture problem where it helps the mold to grow in the shade. So my first question really to you is, do you know of potentially any synergies going on, or do you know if like there is a growing mold problem or spore problem happening, if EMFs can actually help those molds grow or not.
My understanding is that EMF, depending on the strength of the EMF and the organism involved, can be synergistic or it can be antagonistic. It depends on the microorganism. So they have shown for algae, molds, bacteria, and I believe even some viruses that low-level EMF can promote growth. They've shown all kinds of cellular effects, whether it's the actual increase in the reproductive rate or other cellular structures that are increasing in size or in quantity in response to EMF fields. So the answer to that is yes, there can be synergistic effects. With that being said, if you have mold in your home, you need to get rid of it. So if there and so reducing the EMF frequency is not necessarily going to get rid of your mold. So you need to get rid of and eliminate excessive moisture in your home. That's the first thing to do.
Yeah.
So and we do have, we have all kinds of bacteria and fungi living on our, in our microbiome, on our skin surface. I don't know how they're affected. I'm sure depending on, again, the field strength, the strength of the EMF that you're being hit with, it may cause some of these organisms to get injured, or it might inhibit their growth, and others may be stimulated. It's an evolving study, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the frequency used is really interesting to me. Back at Stanford, back in the 1990s, I used to do a lot of plating and petri dish making, and I would grow aspergillus and I'd grow all kinds of really nasty things. And what I noticed sometimes, if there was a certain shaker I had that I would put my colonies of whatever I was going to be growing, and a lot of times some of the collies wouldn't grow that well in the shaker, and they would grow just as well in a worm room. But other times I had them in the shaker, certain types of species, and I noticed, wow, these things are growing like at really accelerated rates. And I look back on that, and it's almost like a test I want to do at some point. I was thinking the shaker itself is going to be producing probably a pretty large magnetic field. So, with the ELFs, with the new radio frequencies, all these other frequencies happening, I'm sure that there's probably some synergies, like you're saying, going on with certain frequencies and with the particular species, and just getting conditions right, if you're, giving it the right temperature and all the other variables with it.
It was funny. I had a friend over who is an engineer, and he works with satellites, and he's one of these people that's been building cell phone towers, So
Nice.
he was a good person to talk about EMF with. Family friends, I couldn't say anything, contradictory, but he said, "Oh, well, EMF's fine. All it does is cause heat. There's nothing negative about it." No, and I didn't have too much to answer to that, but yeah, I mean, it's so complicated. There's so many varied effects, and so many people just don't believe that there's any effect. So
Yeah.
there's going to have to be a lot of research and a lot of getting around the industry propaganda to get the word out on what's really going on.
Yeah, there's plenty of literature out there now, but absolutely the thermal standard is pretty much the holy grail, like, of industry. Like, they're gonna definitely want to try to keep that idea alive, and it's kind of like smoke and mirrors to me. It's like talking about the thermal standard doesn't talk about all the other non-ionizing effects that we're seeing in the observation of the science with different mechanisms in the body at much, much, much lower intensities. So the frequency itself, how the modulation of the information with it, I think could play a role. There's so many variables with light itself and how the light is being used, and how the it turning from a sine wave into something more choppy, for instance. Like that
Hmm.
alone might be cause devastating effects at very low intensities. So this is what obviously needs to really start locking in on the science so people get more aware of, especially those with like EHS or ES, and they'll be like, okay, well, this has a real effect on me, but the exposure time, as you're saying earlier in the podcast about an acute, like an acute condition versus a longer term condition that shows up later. I kind of view this like cigarette smoke, where sometimes it takes like 10, 20, 30 years before some of this starts showing up in a person. But
Right.
all along, and it's probably going to be a synergy with all these other things that we're exposed to as well. It's not just the EMF, but
Hmm.
the EMF can have synergies or influences in ways as well.
Hmm.
So, uh, speaking of like all these other things out there, a big concern people have these days are GMOs. And it's my understanding one of the primary mechanisms that's being looked into right now, and her name is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She has done a lot of research. She has some videos online as well that you can learn a lot of this from. But she has a very interesting idea that she's been studying, where glyphosate can act to like replace glycine in protein structure, or maybe even in the protein synthesis itself. So
Hmm.
when the body creates the amino acid, you have extra chains coming off because glyphosate's getting in there and replacing um, the protein itself and making the protein, like if the viewers don't know, like the three-dimensional structure of how the protein's supposed to look can be altered just by replacing with certain groups that shouldn't be there. So you have a different what's called protein folding. The folding doesn't actually work as it should. Therefore, you have a defective protein, and then over time, certain obviously your proteins are, are major for so many different pathways. But if your protein folding's off whack, that's problematic. There's been a lot of people talking about deuterium the same way. If you have a higher concentration of deuterium that's substituting out hydrogen for the D2O, the extra neutron there, it can affect protein folding. Even other deeper effects in the mitochondria, where some of these things are being used to generate energy. And as we know, if energy generation starts to fail in a cell, the cell will go to backup systems, like down into fermentation processes, and really it's problem, because then the cell could start expressing a disease, or something really bad like cancer.
Hmm.
So I'm really curious if there's other parts of this equation you've been thinking about besides the potential substitution there of glycine, or GMOs in general. Like I'm really looking for more mechanism, some of the mechanisms that could be happening, or other ideas around this subject to help our bodies out by not consuming some of this stuff.
Right. Yeah, GMOs are fascinating assault on our health and well-being of the entire ecosystem, right?
Hmm.
Not just for us, for our animals, for rivers and streams. And I, I, I'd like to just say, a few words about glyphosate and about the history of it. I don't know if your viewers all know how it came into being, but glyphosate was originally produced by the Stafford Company as a descaling agent to remove rust and from pipes.
Wow.
And when they realized that whatever plant material that this descaling agent came in contact with, the plant material died. It just desiccated and died. So Monsanto bought the patent to this material, slapped this countrified rodeo style name Roundup to it. We're going to round up the weeds, and they've made a lot of money, of course, right? All these for decades now, people, backyard farmers and homeowners have sprayed this stuff on their patios and their walkways and driveways and in their beds to kill off all the unwanted weeds. It makes it much easier. Monsanto said that this stuff was biodegradable, it was safe, there was nothing to worry about, basically. So the next part of the equation was that they developed seeds for soybean and corn that could grow in the presence of Roundup. So they would spray. So what they wanted to see happen was the farmer could spray their field with Roundup, kill all the crops on the field, and then plant these seeds, which are called Roundup Ready seeds, and the corn plants could actually grow in this dead soil. Again, the idea being that the plants themselves were healthy because they were able to grow, right?
Mhm.
But what they and what's what we've learned subsequently, and many people knew this already, was that the Roundup was being absorbed by the plant's roots and being deposited into the seeds of the corn and the soybean, right?
Right.
So when you were eating, or if your animal was eating the corn kernels from a Roundup Ready corn plant, they were eating Roundup. And Roundup has, yes, it's an herbicide, but it is also an antibiotic.
Mhm.
Actually, Monsanto got a patent for glyphosate being considered as an antibiotic in addition to a non-selective herbicide. So when you or your animal ingests this, your gut bacteria, your microbiome is killed off. The more you eat, the more of it is killed off. So what does that mean? It means that your digestion becomes affected. There's all kinds of maladies that we have now, and this is one of the things that got me to write my book. I'm sick and tired of seeing people now coming into the radiology department with symptoms of celiac disease, sprue, a
Mhm.
malabsorption syndrome, which when I did my training 25 years ago, nobody had a case of. I mean, if I had to learn it for my boards, but everybody had the same image from their teaching file that they would look at as an example of celiac disease. It was nowhere. I don't think anybody realizes that. It's not genetic. It's not a genetic disease. Nobody had it 25 years ago. Now it is so common, it's scary. I think it's from Roundup. I think it's from these GMO foods. They are affecting the permeability of the intestine because the microbiome is being damaged, and particulates are getting, larger particles of like gluten are being absorbed by the GI tract that shouldn't be, and people are having allergic reactions to it. The other problem, just to get to the farming, so they have Roundup Ready soybeans. There's corn, Hawaiian papaya, and sugar beets are GMO, which now they're using to make granulated sugar instead of sugar cane, which is very bad.
Hmm.
The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is they're spraying wheat fields with Roundup right before harvest to make it easier to harvest the wheat. So and that doesn't, they're not Roundup Ready wheat, it's not GMO wheat, but it's conventional wheat. And so now when these big manufacturers are making their bread products or any of these bakery items with conventional wheat, you have to kind of assume that there's Roundup in the flour because it's sprayed right on the plants to desiccate them right before harvest.
Mhm.
So these are some of the things that we're dealing with in our food supply. Regarding Stephanie, Dr. Seneff, I love her. I think she's awesome. She's a brilliant mind. I'm so grateful that she is uh, taking the plunge to go into this study, because so many scientists that have been ostracized and removed from their positions. It's been a very, it's like a mafia. The Monsanto and these companies, they don't want to lose their market share. They don't want to lose technology. It's extremely important to them. They want to feed the world, and yet they're poisoning the world. So there's a tension there. We need people like Dr. Seneff to do the research in the face of all this adversity. Her theory about the glyphosate being replaced, or replacing glycine,
Mhm.
is fascinating. I'm not a biochemist, and I'm not a microbiologist, so for me to give an opinion about the validity of that, I don't think is really fair. But I think that it's certainly plausible, and I wait for her further results. I mean, I think that we're lucky to have someone like her doing the work.
Absolutely. So yeah, and thinking about this, couple things hit me in your comments, like as our gut itself is being more simplified, and like a lot of, like you were saying, like the gluten can come in and get into like the tight junctions and make them more loose, so these things can be picked up into the bloodstream. It also made me think about, well, there's a lot of different there's now different ways that some of the glyphosate can get into the body. And glyphosate has been detected, like for instance in vaccines and other injections as well. So
Hmm.
it's like, our gut is really beautiful to help eliminate and process down, with our stomach acid, all these things that could come up and hurt us, and also trickle down. Like I like to view it as a trickle effect, where instead of things just being flooded into your bloodstream or into muscle tissue, like for instance with an injection, you have the stomach and the intestines slowly, through the villi, slowly bringing up some of this stuff into the bloodstream at a much slower pace compared to other means of injection. So, it just makes me sick to think that if we don't have, for instance, I've never heard of an organic vaccine or an organic injection or an organic drug for that matter, where doctors go out of their way to make their products as best as possible for the public. It doesn't, like, nobody talks about it. It's like not out there, and it's a little bit ironic since some of the methods of using an IV or all these other things, we don't know really how our food supply is affecting then all the material creation on the pharmaceutical side. And it doesn't seem like there's much regulation over that, or there's no demand from the public to make all of those things that are medicines that a lot of people do rely upon much better for us. I think of my mom. Again, she was diabetic, and all the insulin injections she had over her life, but I have no idea. We just assume magically the insulin injections are coming from a very good source, right?
Right. Well, again, it's a question of volume. How much are you ingesting versus how much is in a capsule. It's a
Hmm.
if you have one of these capsules for a pill that might have some glyphosate residue from its preparation, that's a minuscule amount. Now, if you do have a pill every day, even I still don't think you'd be getting anywhere near the volume that you would be if you had a couple of slices of bread. You
Right.
know what I mean? So, and I don't think realistically there's any way to avoid glyphosate anymore. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in our environment. It's in water. I just think that we have to do our best to try to limit as much as we consume, and hopefully in the next X number of years, however long it takes, we can get it to be banned. That's where it needs to go. But until that happens, I don't see any way to live a glyphosate-free life. Even if you only ate organic foods and bought organic, it's everywhere,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Now, speaking of that, do you know if all the organic laws are kind of the same through the country? I mean, you might not even know this at all, but it just hit me. Um, Certain organic foods that we buy still may have higher amounts of glyphosate compared to a non-organic food. I'm not sure if the labels are ensuring or trying to ensure that the glyphosate, the GMOs are not. I know the GMOs, of course, I think are banned from most organic places, especially here in Oregon, where it started from the Oregon Tithe. But
Hmm.
do you know more about, like, if there's potentially, you buy something organic and it's filled with glyphosate, versus you buy something else next to it, it might not be called organic, but there might not be much glyphosate in it. Like, that's where the consumer is, like, just throwing up their hands, like not knowing what our food supply even has in it.
Well, I can tell you that when they apply some of these sprays into a field, there's drift,
Hmm.
and the drift can go across the street to the organic farm. And so the farmer may not even be aware that there's glyphosate in their soil. I don't believe that an organic farmer is allowed to use uh, those types of chemicals to produce an organic product, but that doesn't mean that it's not already there.
Right.
So, and when you put glyphosate in a soil, I think the law I think you have to have be toxin free or pest. You can't use any of these chemicals, I believe, for like 5 years before you can
That's good.
consider that it's an organic farm. But still, that doesn't take into account drift. And I can tell you, even in my backyard, um, I grow my own vegetable garden.
Hmm.
And every spring, I know when there's neighbors across the hill, when they spray their yard with whatever pesticide and herbicide they're using,
Hmm.
the drift, I end up with spots on the leaves of my vegetables from drift.
Right.
And there, I come outside and all of a sudden everything's half dead. And I know that it's an aerosolized, uh, herbicide because of the way, first of all, it shows up almost immediately and it's a splotchy appearance.
Hmm.
And then after that initial insult, the plant is fine. But that's an example of drift.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. So let's switch gears a little bit back towards EMFs in the home. So obviously we have the Internet of Things that's coming out pretty soon here as 5G is rolling out. Um, I think about personal environments. I like to say that, like, here sitting in my son's bedroom, this is like a micro environment, and I do things in his room to help his situation out. One thing I do specifically, like at night, for instance, I shut the power down to the room, to the rooms along here. I'm very mindful of having really no electronics in here. I actually have the laptop in here, bringing it in, but I'll remove it, once we're done with the podcast here. But it makes me think, like, uh, people right now on EMF Warriors have a very hard time figuring out their EMF situation. And there are some methods available, like there are building biologists in your local area, or even traveling building biologists that can come by and check out your space and let you know more about your EMF situation that you're in. But from your book and your insights, I'm really curious to see, like, what tips, other things you have maybe found useful along the way to help home environments.
So it's interesting today. Earlier today, I went to a reporter's house in my area, and I brought my EMF detector, and I went around his home. I was expecting that there would be a barrage of EMF from everywhere because that's kind of how most people are living now. And I was surprised that he had his Wi-Fi router in the basement, and there was no radiation through the floor, and his ambient EMF throughout his house was only 3 or 4 microwatts. And I was really impressed because, yes, most people have a background much higher than that.
Mhm.
When I first got into this, the assessment in my own home, I went around with my daughter and we evaluated. We had a Wii PlayStation, we had a microwave oven at the time, we had a portable phone in the kitchen.
Mhm.
We had I didn't have a baby monitor anymore, but we had the usual electronics, of course, cell phones, a wireless printer, a wireless alarm system, for security. And what we found were the sources of the greatest EMF were the microwave. It was
Of course.
horrendous. As soon
Right.
as you turn the microwave on, it just blasts the entire floor with EMF.
Mhm.
The second, though, was the cordless phone system.
Mhm.
So the base of the cordless phone was in the kitchen, and the satellites were downstairs. There were 2 satellites. There was one satellite downstairs. There was one upstairs.
Mhm.
And the base unit I had near the kitchen sink. And every time I would do dishes, I felt this underlying anxiety. It was a very subtle, dis, I was just uncomfortable doing the dishes. I didn't know quite why until this experiment. And the EMF from the portable system was incessant. It just was, and it was strong, almost as strong as the microwave. Uh, the third largest emitter was the Wi-Fi router, which was also like a na 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 na, and that was in the basement, but it was strong enough that it came through the floor of my bedroom. So I found out that every time I was sleeping, I go on my bed to sleep, I was being bombarded with this incessant EMF. So the changes I made, I threw out the microwave oven for this reason and for another that it was interesting experiment we did with potatoes, which I'll talk about another time if you want. But so I threw out the microwave and I threw out the cordless phone system and just got landlines, neither of which I have ever missed. With the Wi-Fi router, I put it on a timer. So when I'm ready to go to bed, it clicks off. So there's no more Wi-Fi in the house, much to my kids' dismay, because they love to try to stay up late and after I go to sleep, pretend that they're asleep and they go on their devices. But in any case, now it shuts off and then it comes back on in the morning when I wake up.
Yeah.
And that way I don't have to worry about an EMF coming into the bedroom. The other sources like dirty electricity, even the Wii controller we unplugged every time we weren't using it. The other sources in my home, at least, were very, very small emitters. The background of my home is also 3 to 4, and it's relaxing. I have been in homes where the refrigerator is a strong emitter, the coffee maker may be a strong emitter, the neighbor's house can be a strong emitter, or there could be a cell phone tower. There are paints that you can apply to the inside of your home that will deflect the EMF back to the outside. There's draperies and other fabrics you can use. There's window coverings. There are products in the marketplace. I don't know how well they work. I think they do help a little bit. The other thing that's important that I tell everybody is don't put your cell phone in your pocket. And I'm really glad that the new generation of cell phones are bigger, because now they're almost too big to put in your pocket. I think that's by design. Of course, I'm sure the studies where the sperm counts are dropped even for a couple of hours. If you have a cell phone in your pocket just for a couple of hours, it'll affect the man's sperm count. I know women who used to keep their cell phone in their bra and have had cancers develop in the same place where they had their cell phone.
Yep.
It's just really important not to keep the cell phone on your person unless it's in airplane mode.
Yeah, like I view this, and I try to tell people this as well. It's like you have to think about, especially like you're saying, if you have the cell phone in the specific place that you're doing it day in, day out, those cells and the mitochondria in those cells are potentially being influenced. The DNA in those cells are potentially being influenced. Like all the energy generation could be influenced. So like it's like cigarette smoke. You might do it for a couple of years and you might get away with it. You're playing Russian roulette. You might be okay, but you constantly always put it here, or you always put it in your pocket. And then 20 years down the road, those cells are like, give me a break. What are you doing to me?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And it may not even take 20 years. It may be a lot less than that. You just don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, like I've found that in the kitchen specifically, usually in a person's house, that's like the hot spot. Like you nailed it with the microwave oven, and a lot of problems with microwave ovens. Like I grew up with a radar range, right, back in the 1970s, and
Yeah.
I had it through like 1992, and I look back on that and I'm like, the seals like around the oven were probably decimated. And every time I turned that thing on, I probably was just frying myself because you obviously with a meter, you could detect those things like 30 feet away even.
Well, it's interesting because, remember they used to say that the microwaves didn't leak unless they were damaged or there was something wrong with the seal, right? But nobody had EMF detectors back then
I
to
know.
check. Microwave, I've been to my neighbor's house, I've been to several family members and other friends, and now this guy today and myself. Every microwave that I've ever come across leaks. They all leak. I'm sure of it. And the radiation goes through the wall. It's the only thing that seems to block it is another person. So, like this guy today, I had him stand between my EMF detector and the microwave. And, the emissions that I was reading significantly dropped. And I looked at them and I said, all that radiation is not going into your body. How does that make you feel? It's dramatic. It makes you realize, oh, wow, maybe I should be concerned about this, because it makes it that much more real when you realize you're absorbing it.
Yeah, it's also the most insidious thing that's got to be out there now is like, the forced compliance, almost forced compliance, but of smart meters, because like
Right,
the placement of smart meters, like many homes will have smart meters placed on like the outside wall right where they sleep. So
right,
so that definitely can, depending on the shielding and materials, the wall itself, all these factors go into it, but there could be significant microwave coming into the home.
right.
And the dirty electricity has been, on some of them have been seen to be pretty profound around where the smart meter's at as well, right? So uh, like I knew a woman up in Seattle about 3 years ago, and um, she suddenly out of the blue started complaining of vertigo, headaches, migraines, all this other stuff. And I said, well, I just out of the whim, I told her, I suspect maybe there's a new like either radio frequency tower that was put up in your area, or maybe did you have a smart meter put on your house? And
Hmm.
she's like, oh yeah, they came by like a month ago, it's great. Then now that I have a smart meter, she was like happy about it.
Right,
And
right.
I'm like,
Yep.
well, that is probably what's going on, but I could not convince her that that
Yeah.
might have been the source of her problem. She just, ate it up like smart meters are a fine thing. So it's like, what do you, it's really hard to like convince people on this. And maybe she's changed her mind. I actually haven't talked to her in about 2 years, but maybe that one seed that I gave her might have maybe, let her think, well, what if I move my bed to the whole other side of the room where I'm now another 6, 8 feet away, and you get the, like you said, the inverse square law, where now the intensity levels dropped way down. Maybe hopefully people can start connecting the dots, like with their, especially some of these more intense exposures, like from, cordless phone, which is kind of like a miniature cell phone tower in your home.
Right. I'll tell you an interesting, related story. I had a family member who was diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, which I'm not sure if you're aware of. It's become an epidemic.
Right.
Everybody's got thyroid problems now. And and of course, the treatment that's recommended is either they give you radioactivity to ablate the gland, and then you have to be on Synthroid the rest of your life, or they cut it out.
Mm-hmm.
So I told my sister, just leave it alone. Don't do anything. She went for her follow-up appointment, and again, hyperthyroid. This was, I think, a year later. They were telling her it was very important for her to do something about it, to treat the gland. And just like you, I had this intuitive thought, and I said, where do you have your Wi-Fi router?
Mm-hmm.
It's not in your bedroom, is it? And she said, oh, yes, it is. It's in my bedroom.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what? I want you to move that to the basement, and let's see what happens to your thyroid gland.
Mm-hmm.
So she did. She moved the Wi-Fi router down to the basement, and she went for her follow-up blood work, normal.
Mm.
And
Wow.
after that, and it's been normal ever since. That was many years ago. After that, she started, she was a believer. But sometimes you have to see that cause and effect
Mm-hmm.
to really be convinced. Most people, if you can't see it and you can't taste it and you can't feel it, it's not real. It's these people that are just, they live their lives based on their sensuality. And so something like EMF that you can't sense necessarily, it's not real in in
Yeah.
someone's mind.
Yeah, you made me think of the Princess Bride movie with iocane powder there for a minute. Like if everybody picks up on the reference, like you can't smell it, you can't taste it, everything, but it's the most deadly toxin on the planet. But but yeah, like
Uh,
EMFs, it's like it's like monkey see, monkey do, or like I say this on EMF Warriors from time to time. It's like monkey don't see, monkey don't do. So like if you don't see it, then you'll never want to mitigate it, or like even think about that it could be a poison, a potential toxin coming into your system, into your environments and influencing you in different ways. So
yeah.
let's talk about your book a little bit more. It's Toxic Home, Conscious Home. And I'm really curious, like what else, like what other meat we can like extract out of your book, other
Oh,
topics. Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah, I wrote the book to try to bring people across the bridge, as we were just talking about. If you can't see it and you can't taste it, um, it's kind of that idea. The idea that most people think about their health in terms of biochemistry and physical things that they can relate to, but yet there are other sources of energy. Whether it's EMF, light, sound, even, and then things that are maybe non-local or non-measurable, like feng shui, and even the power of the mind and meditation, and how that we can create a reality with our mind. These are really powerful ideas that I want people to grasp, and how it all affects your well-being. And so it's an attempt to get people to walk down that path,
Mhm.
a path to consciousness, to become aware not only of, is your water contaminated, or are you breathing VOCs in your air? Is your food or your packaging material giving you chemicals that are affecting your hormone levels? I discuss all those things,
Mhm.
but I want people to realize that the energy is also affecting their health and their well-being, and to look at the whole thing together in a holistic view of health. And I'm doing it in the context of the home, because I believe that if we can make our homes healthy and whole, then we can carry it out into the world. But we have to start somewhere, and I think it's doable. People can take one step at a time, do one change every couple of weeks, once a month, whatever it takes, to slowly walk down the path. And I believe that over time, people can really improve their health.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. What I have always thought about is like having like having a very calm, mental, optimistic presence, just the energy you create around yourself and around other people that feel that, you want to be around them, you want to have the security. Like this thing, that all plays into, to me, it plays into your circadian rhythm again and your cortisol and everything else. It's like when we wake up
Oh
in the
yeah.
morning, we you know have the energy and the vitality for life, and we awaken everyone and we're good for the day, and then in the evening we kind of like come down off of it and we start calming down and things become more peaceful. And but like what are we noticing now in our modern world? Like everybody wakes up the opposite. They're all like tired, they're like have no
Right.
energy, and then when they get home at night they're having arguments with people, they're yelling, it's just like it's like the opposite. And that I think does really play a role in health, just like
Yes.
having that attitude, having that this is the time for calm and wellness, this is the time for doing the energizing things that you want to do for the day.
Yeah, I think if people can kind of get this mindset, they'll be healthier. And unfortunately, from my perspective, people are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. Uh, I've been practicing medicine now for 27 years, and the people are getting younger, and uh, it's depressing. It really is. It's really, I find it very depressing that there's so much chronic disease in our country now. And I've done a lot of international travel, and it's here.
Mhm.
It's here. The people are so sick. It's
Yeah.
not everywhere, and
Eh,
it's inexcusable. I mean, we have all this. We're a wealthy country. We have all these natural resources, and we all have wonderful places to live in. All this space and technology, but it's taken over, and we need to put it in its place.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I wrote a little blog like last month on um like your lifespan versus your health span. And everybody's really concentrated. I want to live a long life and have a great lifespan, but it won't matter if your health span is only like 20, 30, 40 years. And that other like, 30, 40 years down the road, you're always visiting the hospital and you have like something chronic going on. And like, yeah, we really need to get people thinking about like books like yours and
thank you.
starting here in the home, groundwork, getting at least your secure space, getting your bedroom just secured, making sure you're not having mold, all these other things that can contribute to a poor health. So I really appreciate everything you shared with us today. And if there's any other things you want to mention to the EMF warriors, I think we're almost getting to the end of the episode here.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was really a lot of fun, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my beliefs. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Brown. And if in the future, I'd love to have you back on and see, fast forward a few months or, a few months down the road and see how things are going and see the feedback you're getting from your book. I'm really excited to get this and read it through because I try to pick up every aspect that could relate to the EMFs. And your book looks like it's got a lot of juicy material in it for me. So thank you. Yep.
You're welcome. It's encompassing, but I wrote it with the intent to reach a broad audience. So I've tried to make it as reader friendly as possible. It's not a lot of technical words, but the ideas and the concepts, were put out there. So I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right, you take care.
All right, you too.